My name is Bert Mulcahy. I've worked for East Bay Mud for approximately 14 years. I work primarily in the East Bay watershed. East Bay Mud owns about 28,000 acres in the East Bay, and I do most of the species monitoring in the East Bay. And today, Lori asked me to come talk to you a little bit about the fish species that live in San Leandro Creek watershed. So we're going to talk a little bit about what those species are and how the habitat affects their distribution. So we're starting here with an overview map of the San Leandro Creek watershed. Down here at the bottom you have San Francisco Bay. The lower end of the creek goes from San Francisco Bay to Chabot Reservoir. The middle section here up to San Leandro Reservoir. And then the headwaters of the main stem are up behind Oakland in the Canyon Moraga area. There's a lot of, I just highlighted the main drainage here so you could focus on it, but there's a lot of small tributaries that come in between here. And I'll come back to this map when we talk a little bit about the sections of the creek and how they differ. This is a list of the fish species that we've captured in our surveys over the last 15 years or so. This is pretty much everything we've captured. Keep in mind that we have a list of native species and a list of non-native species. That doesn't mean that these are all represented in equal numbers in the creek, but we have captured rainbow trout, steelhead, steelhead, and I'll talk about that a little later. Three-spine stickleback, Sacramento sucker, prickly sculpin, and that's our native complement. And then we've also captured non-native fish species such as goldfish, carp, bluegill, largemouth bass, and mosquito fish. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the natives here to give you an idea. We'll start with California roach. This is a native minnow. It gets about 4 inches in length, eats algae and small invertebrates. An interesting fish. It could tolerate very high temperatures and low oxygen levels. And that makes it well adapted for creeks that don't have a lot of flow. You can find it distributed widely throughout the Bay Area and Northern California. This is a prickly sculpin. It's another native fish that's pretty widely distributed. It gets to about 4 inches in length. The way you distinguish it, it has a very large head for its body size and a large mouth. Eats mostly invertebrates and can be found in most local creeks. Sacramento sucker, another nice native. This fish can get up to 2 feet in length, especially in reservoirs and larger river systems. Here in the local creeks, you tend to see them more in the 6 to 8 inch range. They don't tend to get as big in the local creeks unless they have a reservoir to go to feed at some point. They have a subterminal mouth, so right here on the bottom of their chin, their mouth is pointed downward, adapted for bottom feeding. And they also eat mostly, algae and invertebrates, anything they can grub up from the bottom. This is one of my favorite native fishes. Unfortunately, this photo really doesn't do them justice. This is a three-spine stickleback. It's a native fish that's pretty small. It gets up to maybe 3 inches long. The interesting thing is on the dorsal fin up here and around the pectoral fins, they have spines that they can lock in place when they feel threatened by something. So trying to eat this is like eating a porcupine. It's a pretty good defense for them versus a lot of fishes that might eat them. They eat invertebrates mostly, and they have very wide salinity tolerances. It can be found in complete saltwater, complete freshwater, and all kinds of variations in between. So they can be in almost any type of local habitat. They're really well known for their unique mating ritual, where the male builds a nest, gluing stuff together from secretions from its kidney, builds a little tunnel, and then does a little mating dance to get the female to go back to the nest and mate. And then the male actually stays there and takes care of the young until at least the eggs hatch. He'll fan it with its tail for a while until they hatch, and try to keep them around for a little while until they go out on their own. This is a fish that you can find almost anywhere in almost any of the creeks. It has such ability to handle habitat degradation. Steelhead, I'm going to talk several slides about steelhead rainbow trout because it's one of the most interesting things to people. This is a steelhead is a native member of the salmon trout family, get up to 4 feet in length. One of the things about this family is they have an adipose fin, this little nub up here between the dorsal fin and the tail fin there. They eat a wide variety of items. They're very economically important, so that gives them a lot of attention. And they're hatchery supplemented. So this is a picture of a trout from up in the upper watershed. This is actually a steelhead I took a picture of in Pinole Creek because I don't have a whole lot of action pictures for steelhead. They're hard to photograph. So let's talk a little bit about rainbow trout steelhead. Rainbow trout and steelhead are actually the same species, genetically identical. The only difference that really distinguishes them is their behavior. So rainbow trout are born in these smaller creeks and rivers, and they spend their entire life in fresh water. Steelhead, on the other hand, are born in those same creeks and rivers, but they choose to go to the ocean and spend their adulthood, and then they come back to those creeks and rivers to spawn. So you get a steelhead here, in this case, another one. These fish are actually also from Pinole Creek, but this is a 24-inch steelhead or so found in the upper watershed, and you can see the resident, you're looking at 6 to 10-inch fish as opposed to fish that are more than twice that long if they go to the ocean. So it's important to note that this steelhead could come up here and produce rainbow trout and steelhead offspring. It's not a one or the other thing, so it's very difficult, obviously, to figure out when you find fish in a smaller size range, smaller than this, no way to really tell if they're rainbow trout or steelhead by just collecting them and looking at them. So for the most part, the agencies consider the fact that if there's barriers and they have ability to go to anadromy, they're considered potentially steelhead. So the habitat characteristics for rainbow trout and steelhead are pretty specific, and they require things such as cool water temperatures, suitable spawning areas, and access to those areas from the ocean. This is a pretty blurry picture, but there's a couple of fish here. There's one here and another one next to it that they're basically digging a nest here in the gravel. So they require those suitable spawning gravels to be able to reproduce. Also have to have suitable water quality and a good quality food source to sustain these populations. And one last thing here about why steelhead are considered so important. Of course, they're economically valuable. People like to catch them, like to eat them. They have a general appeal because they're just a really beautiful fish, and they have an interesting life history where, it's not too often you get large fish that come up into these small creeks, start thrashing around and spawning. They're also a very good indicator species because, of course, when you start to alter the habitat, they're the first thing to really suffer from it. So what we're going to talk about now is just the fish species and how they relate to the habitat in the creek. So we have, again, down here at the bottom, the San Francisco Bay to Chabot is basically, I just call it the lower San Leandro Creek. And then from Chabot Reservoir up to Upper San Leandro Reservoir, the middle section of the creek. And then the main stem here above Upper San Leandro Creek, but that's just a small part of the habitat. There's Redwood Creek and Kaiser and several others here that are tributaries that provide habitat above San Leandro Reservoir. So what about the lower watershed? We have the section from San Francisco Bay to Chabot. It's definitely highly urbanized. I'm sure you all probably have some idea what the creek looks like down there. A lot of flood control channel, pollution issues. These pictures were taken this past summer. This is very far down in the creek, down near the bay where the airport is. Probably some of the worst potential habitat for native species you could imagine. Not very good, and it only gets slightly better as you go upstream, and you have these interesting, looks like engineered attempt at biological system here. I don't know, with some cobble and a channel, but it's still You might see stickleback in here. This section can support those fish that can take warmer water temperatures, but for the most part, not good habitat for native fish. If you go farther upstream, you have issues also, I assume, based on probably flood control issues. The channel has very little, if any, diversity, and it's basically a wide braided channel, and the water ends up going underground in this section rather than flowing downstream. So some of the lower watershed fish species. Here's a photo of a small trout caught this past year in San Leandro Creek. It's a neat picture, but unfortunately for them, they're mostly limited to the very upper end of the lower San Leandro Creek, that 1 mile section below Chabot Dam down to maybe 580 or so. That's the only really decent habitat usually for the species. It can vary a little bit, but that's for the most part. These native fish are limited in distribution in the lower watershed. You have three-spine stickleback, which are the only real native that tends to do well down in the lower section of the creek. Non-native fish, particularly mosquito fish, kind of flourish down there in the flood control channels in the lower end of the creek. So this whole area is dominated by non-natives and stickleback in most years. So the middle watershed from Chabot Reservoir up to San Leandro has East Bay Regional Park district land, Willow Park Golf Course, some East Bay mud watershed, and this section is a mix of natural and altered creek channels. Probably the biggest influence on fish populations there is Chabot Reservoir. So the creek populations in that section between the dams is really heavily influenced by those fish that come up from Chabot Reservoir. You end up with, here's a picture of some carp, but you have stocked rainbow trout, bluegill, largemouth bass, goldfish, and carp, which get up into the creek. The native fish in that section are mostly absent. There's not a lot of quality habitat. And again, the non-natives dominate the middle stretch of San Leandro Creek. The upper watershed, a very different story. The East Bay mud watershed and the towns of Moraga and Canyon. The creek channels are much more natural, in a much more natural state. You can see that the channels in that area are a lot less altered. You have cool water temperatures, limited urban influence. There's areas of Moraga Creek that have some significant influence of urban activities, but for the most part, most of these drainages are in pretty good shape by Bay Area standards. Because of those conditions, rainbow trout dominate in these upper tributaries. We also have native Sacramento sucker and prickly sculpin above upper San Leandro Reservoir. The non-native fish species are mostly confined to the reservoir itself. Again, the habitat's more natural. It favors the native species. This trout population is a pretty unique resource and pretty important. One of the nice things is that having been isolated by the dam for so long, this reservoir has limited, if any, effects of hatchery planting. This reservoir was never promoted for fishing. They didn't stock it with trout. And that's been a problem all over the state where these hatchery fish breed with the natives, and the hatchery fish just have a lower fitness, and they don't survive as well as the natives, and they dilute the gene pool. So the nice thing about this population is it is kind of a unique resource that can be used potentially to reintroduce as creeks in the Bay Area hopefully get restored to have proper habitat. We have stocks that can be used to potentially put wild fish back in these creeks. These are just a few slides of some of the fish we've caught up there. The two upper slides here representing adult fish that were caught in San Leandro Reservoir. The two lower slides showing fish from the creek tributaries. You can see they're both sizable fish. You have fish a lot of times in the 12 to 18, 19 inch range. So a lot of these reservoir fish are actually approaching the sizes of steelhead that go to the ocean. They're substituting the reservoir for their ocean life cycle because they can't get out of the reservoir. These larger fish are actually reservoir fish coming up into the creeks to spawn. The residents thrive in these creeks, but they're a much smaller size, 6 to 8 inches maybe. So just a little bit here about East Bay mud, our management. We do a lot of monitoring in the watershed. We do spawning surveys to verify spawning success, rainbow trout. We do habitat mapping, which gives us an idea of the habitat quality and any barriers that might be present in the tributaries. Population sampling, mostly electrofishing, sampling the population to get some ideas of the health of the population. Done a few telemetry studies to identify identify key habitat features in the creeks and in the reservoir. So we've been looking at the areas of habitat in the reservoir that they can use, and we've been looking at in the creeks to see what their key areas are of habitat, so we can protect those areas and make sure that we sustain a good population. And the population USL reservoir is doing quite well from any measurement we have. Watershed management is pretty important too, because we have to maintain a healthy riparian zone, protect water quality, and we've removed barriers where we find them when we know they're significant enough to actually prevent fish from getting to their spawning grounds. So we now know where the best spawning areas are and where we want the fish to get on average years. And just kind of a wrap up, what can you do? It's important to educate the public about the fish and wildlife resources we have around here, so people know why they're important and why they're worth preserving and improving. Pollution prevention programs. San Leandro Creek obviously has significant issues with pollution. Most of the Bay Area creeks are in the same boat. You know, a lot of times it's very easy for us to look at a refinery or a large corporation and say they're destroying everything, but you know, a lot of the studies that have been done have really shown that, you know, even though we do a little bit each, you know, when you add all of us up, there's a lot of us, and we have big effects on our creek systems. It's a good thing to encourage habitat restoration when these flood control projects get to their lifespan and we have a chance to potentially return these to a more natural system. They're never going to be perfectly natural, but you can definitely make these, design these channels so that there is habitat for native species and they can maybe expand in the creek. And you should always encourage your public agencies to manage for these native species wherever possible. Hopefully we can improve habitat and improve the range of these species.